All right, you got the look hacking system, which makes you pretty dang smart for having this. This is gonna have a huge impact in your films because you're finally gonna be able to create the same look as your inspirations, whatever your ideas are. You're gonna be able to now do this, okay? You're gonna be able to achieve those looks and you're gonna be able to apply them on your own projects. And that's what this system is all about. We're gonna actually go through the process of how to do this, how to break down a look of 2 different Hollywood films, and then show you how to apply those looks on clips of your own, okay? Now this may seem daunting, but we're gonna follow a process that will make this super simple and easy to follow, okay? So we're gonna ask ourselves a few questions about the look with the goal of being able to translate that look into language. Once we understand that language, then we can then turn that into actionable corrections, and we can use the help of our video scopes to apply that same look to our footage. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you wanna make sure that your footage has a similar art direction to the reference image for obvious reasons. Though we can make some pretty significant changes to the look in CinemaGrade, there are gonna be those limitations to how much we can change a scene. Okay, so here are the things we need to specifically ask ourselves when evaluating a look. First, we'll ask some very general questions that revolve around the hue, saturation, and luma of the reference still. We'll follow a workflow that incorporates all of those, but in a different order than what I've previously outlined. Like for instance, in the typical color grading workflow for doing basic color correction, we first look at the luma, then move to the hue, then finally the saturation. So following that order, let's take a look at the luma-related questions we should be asking ourselves. Number 1, what is the brightness and contrast like in the image? Is it a bright scene or a dark scene? Would you consider the contrast to be high key or low key? You'll want to get a good screen grab from the film that you're trying to emulate, so that way we can bring that into CinemaGrade and analyze it using the video scopes. Once we do that, we can ask more specific questions like, where's the trace gathered in the waveform? Is there detail in the shadows, and if so, how much? Is there detail in the brightest highlights, and if so, how much? Then we move on to analyzing the color in the image. What colors do you see? Does the image have a single dominant color? Does the scene follow a particular color scheme? What color are the highlights? What color are the shadows and undertones? And as the final step in the workflow, let's ask ourselves a question: what are the saturation levels like? Is there a certain object or color that is emphasized or more saturated than the others? Armed with this information, we can then recreate any look that we like. Again, assuming that the art direction and the type of shot is similar to the source material we're trying to emulate. In this tutorial, we're going to recreate the looks from Mad Max Fury Road and from the film Her. The first thing we'll need is a good high-resolution reference still. If you have a Blu-ray available, that will give you the best quality, but in most cases, pulling from streaming sites will give you a good result as well. Just be careful when pulling stills from the internet because the stills you find on Google are often highly compressed and oversaturated because the grading of the trailer might actually be different to the actual film. Now, to get those screen grabs, you can grab a still by using the keyboard shortcut Command-Shift-3 as the video plays back. The still will then appear on your desktop. In our case, I've already gone ahead and grabbed all the stills that we need. For our first example, we're going to use 2 different reference stills from Mad Max Fury Road. One of them is a close-up shot of Max's face, and the other is a wide shot that shows the sky. Let's start by asking ourselves the questions I mentioned earlier so that we can put this look into language. Speaking generally, with regard to brightness and contrast, these are bright daytime images with high contrast. Using the video scopes to assist us, you can see that the waveform confirms the high contrast based on the expanded trace on both images. Now we should look for highlight and shadow detail. Except for the brightest highlights on the car, the highlights maintain detail. If you look at the highlights on Max's forehead, you can see this more clearly. The shadows, while not crushed on the waveform, are pretty deep and don't maintain as much detail. So now that we've evaluated the reference still for contrast, let's match it the best we can using the video scopes as our guide. Now, in order to compare the stills to our footage, we need to be able to see the images side by side and their corresponding traces in the scopes as well. Now, the only way to do this inside CinemaGrade is in the shot matching page, but we need to be able to build the look in the final grading page so that the look can be applied on top of all the clips that are part of the same group. So to be able to see both images side by side while grading, we'll need just a little workaround. Whether you're in Premiere or Final Cut Pro 10, you need to drag the reference stills into a timeline and apply the CinemaGrade effect to them as you would with any other clip you want to grade. Then we can open CinemaGrade and see the stills in the corresponding scopes in the base correction page. Now we just need to take a screenshot for each still. I'll close CinemaGrade, go to the timeline with the edit I want to grade, and open CinemaGrade again. I'll go to the final grading page. We'll begin using the image of Max as our reference for now. So I'll go to the desktop, open the screenshot with the image of Max, and resize both the screenshot preview and the CinemaGrade interface so we can see both at the same time. Now we have a side-by-side view of both images and scopes. The footage I want to grade was shot with a log gamma profile, but I already performed a base correction on it in the base correction page to get it to a good starting point. So now all we're doing right now is just creating the look. Looking at both images side by side, we can tell the reference still has more contrast with darker shadows. So I'll begin by bringing down the shadows with the Shadows Mids Highs tool and bring the midtones back up to compensate so that the skin tones remain well exposed. I'll keep tweaking the midtones and shadows until we reach a nice balance. Okay, now let's move on to color. The first question we should ask is, what colors do we see? In both reference stills, we can see a heavy amount of orange as well as cyan in the sky. If you look at the vector scope, you can see that this film follows a complementary color scheme, which means that almost all the colors in the scheme sit directly across from each other on the color wheel. The shadows and undertones have a very slight teal quality to them, while the highlights are neutral in color. Our image right now has mainly three main colors or ranges of colors. A mix of yellow and red in the skin tones, hair, walls, and field. Some green in the background from the trees, and blue from the sky. The warm tones in our reference still are much more saturated and closer to a strong orange. So what we need to do while looking at the vector scope, we need to modify the hue and saturation of these warm colors until the trace resembles the one from our reference image. For this, I'll choose the vectors tool, click over the skin tones, hold down the shift key and dragging up to max out the saturation, and then just click and drag up and down to modify the hue. I'll click over the walls that contain more yellow and do the same. I'll keep tweaking this a little bit until we get the right colors. Now the last step we did brought out more of the orange in the trees, so we don't need to worry about them anymore. They now are inside our color scheme. Let's continue with the sky. I'll bring up our second reference image with the blue sky. And again with the vectors tool, I'll click over the sky and bring up the saturation by holding down the modifier key shift and dragging up, and then change the hue by dragging up and down until it resembles the sky in the reference image. And voila, a Mad Max Fury Road look in just a few minutes. Let's take a look at the before and after. So again, to match this look, we followed the following steps. We grabbed a high resolution still from the source material that we wanted to emulate. We defined the look using the color language that we just discussed, and then we created a split screen view with the video scopes so we could achieve our match. So let's try this one more time with a completely different look. In this case, we're gonna pick a still from the movie Her. And by the way, the example image that we're using to match to her is from filmsupply.com. The artist is Cypher, and it's from the Cosmic Event collection. Just like before, we'll first need to put this look into language. In general, this is conveying an overcast afternoon and has moderately low contrast with elevated shadows and muted highlights. Let's take a look at just the skin tones. As you can see, they sit between zones 3 and 6. Okay, so let's begin our grade. I already took a screenshot of our reference image with the scopes and performed a base correction on this clip. It was really dark and cool, and now it looks well exposed and balanced. Now going to the final grading page, as you can see, the highlights are too hot, so I'll begin by bringing them down with the shadows, mids, highs tools, clicking and dragging down on a bright point, and then click on a midtone area and drag up to compensate. Then I'll drag the shadows down to recover some of the contrast. I'll keep tweaking this, bouncing back and forth between the different points until the waveform looks more closer to the reference. Although both traces now seem to have highlights, midtones, and shadows sitting in the same ranges, our image is lacking some contrast. So I'll use the keyboard shortcut C to switch to the contrast tool and drag up to increase the contrast. Much better. Now, after this exposure change, it has become even more obvious that our image is way cooler than the reference. So let's bring the color temperature up with the keyboard shortcut W and then dragging up. You'll see this affected our highlights, bringing them up, so let's put them back where they belong. I'll shift back to the Shadows Midtones Highlights tool, click over the sky, and drag down. Now both traces are looking much closer, both in terms of exposure and color bounce. But the warm colors still need some help. I'll use the Vectors tool to introduce more yellow in the skin tones and bring up the saturation. I'll also bring up the Luma using the modifier command and dragging up to get it much closer to the reference. Our talent looks much better, but the buildings in the back need more red like the buildings in the reference image. So I'll click over them, tweak their hue by dragging up and down, and by holding the modifier key, Command, I'll bring up the Luma just a bit. You'll see this is affecting the skin tones too, but not to worry, we'll tweak them again until we reach a sweet spot. As a final touch, there is a blue building in the background. I'll just click over it and hold the modifier key Shift and drag down to reduce its color. And our her look is complete. Let's take a look at a before and after. Wow, that's a huge difference. As you can see, having both images side by side with scopes makes matching looks really easy. Again, the way to do this is to just break down the look of a reference into color language and then use these steps with the side-by-side comparison to implement those changes. And just as a reminder, if you're trying to match clips together, then you use the built-in shot matching page in CinemaGrade. But if you're going for that final look, then you'll want to arrange the UI like I've done here with a screenshot so that the final look is applied to all the clips as sort of a filter effect, okay? Well, I hope this tutorial has helped you understand this process. I suggest that you get some practice. That's the only way that you're gonna actually get better. And I would absolutely love for you to share with me your results on the CinemaGrade Facebook group. It's just such a fun challenge. You can also get others involved by seeing if they can match the reference still as well and provide them with the image. But I'd love to see the results that you get using this system, okay? All right, happy hacking.